Old City of Jerusalem, and welcome to another Aish.com live class. Today, since I'm the Aish Rabbi and historian, we're going to be focusing special class. Since this is a special week and we hit the month of ER, we are focusing on two important days in the history of the modern state of Israel, which is Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, and followed immediately by Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, back to back. This year is unusual because of the coronavirus. Normally, these are 2 days that are nationally celebrated publicly and outdoors, and today, unfortunately, due to the situation, neither Yom HaZikaron or Yom Ha'atzmaut are going to be celebrated in the normal fashion, which is visiting cemeteries, experiencing that official state-sponsored memorial ceremony, or the National Party Day, which begins the day after, which is Yom Ha'atzmaut. But in any case, the day is still the day, and I would like to focus a little on the historical background of what Memorial Day means, and then we're going to do a second class on actually Independence Day. Before we talk about Memorial Day, it's important to understand, I'm sure many of you watching have been to Israel. We have to understand the importance of the idea of the IDF in the mentality of Israel. Every country in the world has a standing army. I'm going to speak from experiences both an Israeli and an American. America has not had a draft army since the 1970s during the Vietnam War, after they ended the draft. Afterwards, Israel, because it's literally been in a state of war and a state of emergency since its founding more than 70 years ago, has a draft army. So the whole military is a much bigger thing for Israelis than it is for, let's say, the average American or the average Brit or probably the average South African or Australian or wherever you are watching this today, where armies today are basically a volunteer and even a career for people, which is very, very different attitude. I personally, my father served in the Air Force. He was drafted. We lived, as a matter of fact, when I was little, in Morocco. He was a captain, a doctor in a strategic air command base in the 1960s. So we lived there for a few years, but that was when there was a draft. Nowadays, probably most of us don't even know people who have served in the military. We have to appreciate that before we look at Memorial Day to understand how central is the whole concept of the military in the Jewish state. Because, again, there is mandatory military service in Israel for boys, for men and for women, although women, if they want, could be exempt, and men can also do national service in place of. We also have people getting exemptions for various reasons. There's the whole issue of much of the ultra-Orthodox world not serving in the army. We're not going to go into that topic at all. But for the vast majority of Israelis, beginning at the age of 18, and for the vast majority of men, you will do, well, they just shortened the service. Used to be 3 years, 36 months. Now it's down to 32 months. And for women, generally, it's a little over 2 years now, although women who serve in combat units also can do 3 years of service. Just to give a little background before we go into the topic, personally, I came to Israel I came to Israel in my 20s, but I didn't make Aliyah till I was basically 30, because I was a student in yeshiva and a foreign national. But I did get drafted then, something they wouldn't do today. Today, they don't take you after the age of 24. So I did a very basic training, and then I volunteered to be in a combat unit. And I was in a combat infantry unit, and I did basically 12 years of reserve duty. So while I didn't do the full Army experience as an 18-year-old, I did have definitely a taste of what it's like to be in the Israeli Army. I also have 5 children. I have 2 boys and 3 girls, and almost all of them did the Army. My oldest son was a medic and a sniper in the paratroopers. Interesting combination of jobs. My second oldest son, who is now an emergency room nurse, was a combat medic in the Golani Brigade. Interesting, because that's the biggest rivalry in the IDF, paratroopers and Golani, and I had them in the same bedroom together. I have a middle daughter who did national service, and now she's an oncology nurse, and I had identical twin girls. One of them served also as a combat medic. We had 3 combat medics in my house. They used to sit around Saturday night after Shabbat, putting needles in each other's arms for practice. She served in what was then the only mixed male-female combat unit in the IDF, which was called Karakal, as a combat soldier and a medic. She did 3 years of service, and her twin sister was a chief engineer in the Navy. She was a chief engineer on a Navy tugboat in Haifa and Bat Galim. So I definitely have somewhat of a personal experience with the army. But you have to appreciate that in Israel, the military is such a big thing. Normally, an American kid at 17, 18 years old is preparing to graduate high school and go to college, and the big pressure is on to get good grades, good SAT scores. I don't know if they still do SATs, and get into a good school, you know, Ivy League, whatever, to go on to your life. Israelis, it's a different thing. At that age, they begin the process of processing you for the military already when you're in high school, around 16 years old. You get called in for a number of interviews and tests. They want to see what your abilities are. The best and the brightest are chosen for special units. And basically what my kids were doing when they were in their senior year of high school was working out physically to get ready for the gibushim, the tryouts to get into the most dangerous elite combat units, whether it's the paratroopers or whatever, you know, so to make sure that the parents don't sleep for the next 3 years because they're doing something really dangerous. But this is the average Israel's idea of you know, preparing to do something meaningful, which by the way means that when an Israeli young adult goes into the university, it's usually post-army. They've usually done 2 to 3 years of army, often in combat units. And I always like to say that an Israeli 21 or 22-year-old is on a completely different level than the average American of the same age, precisely because their life experience is so much different. And again, because you're in Israel, and I said Israel has been involved in wars since its inception, it's a very personal thing. Just as most of us probably don't know people in, let's say, America who are currently serving in the military. I actually do know one friend who's serving as a rabbi, as a chaplain in the U.S. Army, but generally we don't know so many people. In Israel, not only do you know someone, most people have served in the army, and it's a generational thing. I serve, my kids serve, my grandchildren, if there's still, unfortunately, conflict going on, they will have to serve. So war is a very personal thing. Probably most of us don't know anyone. If you're in America, Memorial Day is a national holiday. I'm not being cynical, but it's basically become a shopping day. It's a day off. It's Memorial Day weekend. The history of Memorial Day, by the way, was first established after the Civil War. And by the way, the North and the South, post-Civil War, 1866, celebrated different dates. But it really became a national holiday after World War I. But again, a lot of Americans have died in wars in the last century, but still few of us know people who have died in wars, even though America's been involved currently in its longest conflict in Afghanistan, the longest war in United States history. So that's one very important thing. In Israel, everyone knows people who have been killed in combat. It's a much more intense, up close and personal thing. Not only because so many Israelis are in the military, not only because we've been involved in so many wars constantly, literally, there is a war every decade in Israel's history. We're talking about 7 decades. We're going into our 8th decade of history. There's been a war, a major war, a somewhat minor war, and sometimes more than one war. And interspersed with the war is constant conflict, terrorism. We're dealing with constant stress today in Israel, the border with Lebanon, the border with Hezbollah, the border with Hamas and Gaza. But every one of Israel's wars is up close, personal, and a war on some level for the defense of the homeland or for national survival, which makes the fighting much more intense, much more meaningful. There's no questions about, going off to Southeast Asia to fight in like Vietnam. You don't really have the anti-war movements like you have. People realize that we are surrounded, a teeny tiny country the size of New Jersey surrounded by 22 states of the Arab League, hundreds of millions of Arabs surrounding us, borders on all sides with countries that are either in a state of war with us or in a state of cold peace with us. And even the peace, which is cold, is something relatively new. So it's very, very different experience. That's what you have to appreciate when we go into Memorial Day. When you hear it on the radio, if you haven't been here, it's not just a weekend thing. It's a huge, important day. And normally, what would normally happen on a Memorial Day in Israel, and we have to appreciate that when the State of Israel was established by the secular Zionist leadership, they sort of set up their own kind of holiday cycle. When I say holiday cycle, Judaism traditionally has a yearly holiday cycle. We have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. We have this yearly cycle of, we have Passover, then Shavuot, then Sukkot. There's different themes and placed throughout the time of year with different significances and different focuses. So when they're creating the modern state of Israel, although it is steeped with many Jewish things, not just Hebrew, the secular Zionist leadership of this country created a holiday cycle. When I say holiday cycle, not in the traditional sense, but the week before, last week, we had the Holocaust Memorial Day for the victims and the martyrs and the fighters in the Holocaust. That's the week before. The national ceremony for that will take place at Yad Vashem, which is the national memorial site, which, by the way, is located on the same hill, more or less, as Mount Herzl, which is the national military cemetery for Israel, but on a lower level, lower down. And that is the site which has the museum. There's no one buried in Yad Vashem, but I'm sure many of you have been there. It's one of the most visited tourist sites in Israel, but that's the site which is both the commemoration and educational site for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. So you have that commemoration day where a siren goes off during the day. There's a ceremony at night. Holocaust survivors light 6 torches. By the way, there's still slightly less than 200,000 Holocaust survivors still alive today in Israel, but the average age is in the early 80s. Within a decade or so, there'll be almost no one left. And all those people were children during the Holocaust. Fast forward to the week after, and we enter back-to-back a very intense period of Memorial Day for Israel's fallen, commemorating the almost 24,000 Israelis who have died in the line of duty since Israel's war of independence in 1948 until today. And again, this is a very heavy day. Like I said before, very much unlike the Memorial Day in America. The country closes down completely. It's not like Shabbat where you can't drive your car, but all places of entertainment, restaurants, movie theaters, everything is closed. At nighttime, at 8 o'clock at night, a siren goes off for 1 minute and everything just comes to a standstill. Even on the highway, the cars stop, people get out of the cars and stand still. It's not a traditional Jewish way of mourning, but it's the way the modern state of Israel has decided to mark it. In the morning, you have at 11 a.m., I believe, a 2-minute siren. All the air raid sirens go off. It's very loud. It's a continuous sound, not the normal wailing sound you'd get during God forbid, an air raid or a missile attack. The whole country comes to a halt again, and you have official memorial ceremony, which takes place at Yad Vashem. Not Yad Vashem, excuse me, at Mount Herzl, which is the hill that is higher. It's the highest hill in Jerusalem, and that is the sort of Arlington National Cemetery for the Jewish people. There are a lot of military cemeteries in Israel. A country the size of New Jersey has got 36 military cemeteries. Every city and town has a military cemetery. If you die in uniform, whether it be in action or even in a car accident, if you're in uniform at the time, you get buried in a military cemetery. In your local community, that's where most people choose to be buried. But many people are buried. There's 3,500 fallen Israeli soldiers from all of Israel's wars buried in Mount Herzl, and it is the national military cemetery for Jerusalem and much of the surrounding area of Jerusalem. But you have a lot of military cemeteries. By the way, there are 1,200 war memorials in Israel. I'm not talking about plaques for terrorist attacks. So this is a country that has constantly been in a state of war, not just in its history, but certainly in its modern history. And unfortunately, military cemeteries, war memorials everywhere, because this is the home front, or very close to us is the home front. I'm sitting in the old city where you couldn't until June 6th, June 7th of 1967. This was Jordanian occupied territory. But Yad Vashem is the sort of Arlington National Cemetery of the Jewish state. And not only 3,500 fallen Israeli soldiers buried there, but there are various memorials for various tragedies. There's a war memorial for the 200,000 Jewish soldiers who fell fighting in the Soviet Army in World War II. There's a memorial for the Dakar, a submarine that sunk in the Mediterranean decades ago on its way to Israel. But that's also the place where the official ceremony will take place. This year there will be a ceremony, but it won't be attended by the public because of the coronavirus. And we go right from, so Memorial Day is a day of intense feelings. When my kids were soldiers in the Army, in active duty, they would be assigned to go stand in different cemeteries. Many of them would go to Yad Vashem on the day and stand next to the grave of a specific soldier, especially a soldier who maybe didn't have anyone there to visit his or her grave site. And they would be standing there when the siren would go off at 11 o'clock. So all the bereaved families go to visit the cemeteries, and especially Yad Vashem. And there's an official ceremony that takes place at the very top, because not only is, keep saying Yad Vashem, I apologize. Not only is Mount Herzl a military cemetery, it is also the burial place at the very top for the driving force behind the modern Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, and also many of the political leaders, prime ministers, presidents, heads of the Jewish Agency, and a few other notable personalities are also buried around a little lower down. And again, just as there was sort of a secular holiday cycle put in by the non-religious Zionist leadership that founded the State of Israel, there's a whole meaning to the placement of these different memorial sites. At the very top of the hill is the burial site of Theodor Herzl himself, who, while he died in 1904, was brought to Israel in 1949. His body was taken around the country on tour, the official, he gets to see the country posthumously that he fought so hard to create. And then he's buried at the top. Below him, the leadership, the people whose lives were dedicated to the creation and running of the Jewish state, presidents, prime ministers. Below them is the military cemetery. And below that is Yad Vashem itself. And the statement being made is all of these people are holy people who died in various ways for the Jewish people at various periods of time, whether in the state of Israel or in the Holocaust. But clearly there's a hierarchy of secular holiness, and the highest is Herzl, political leadership, soldiers. And the lower level are the people who died in the Holocaust. Not to go into that very interesting talk now about modern Zionist perception of the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust. But we also have to talk for a few minutes about what we're commemorating on Memorial Day. Just to run through, because this is a massive topic, Israel's wars. But Israel, as I said, has been involved in wars from its inception until today, unfortunately. And if we just run through a list to give you a taste of them, we also have to appreciate, when we're doing Memorial Day, that Israel is a small country. There's about 6.5 million Jews living in Israel. There are 330 million, again, I'm using American citizens. So when you're dealing with a small country with a small population, one death is statistically a far larger percentage of the population than a larger country. The way if you want to work it out mathematically, every Israeli, God forbid, who dies, a soldier who dies, is the equivalent of 50 American soldiers dying in a war. So again, not only is it up close, personal, home front is the wars, we're on the front lines here, but it's a much more personal experience than anything you could experience, I think, anywhere else in the world. But in 1948, May 14th, 1948, Israel will declare itself a state. In Mayor Dizengoff's house, the Tel Aviv Art Museum in Tel Aviv, which is undergoing renovations today, but Probably some of you have seen it. Independence Hall, as it's called. David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the state, calls for the creation of a Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years and peace with our Arab neighbors. Within a few hours of Israel declaring itself a state, the Egyptian Air Force will bomb Tel Aviv. 5 Arab armies will declare war and invade, and Israel would be faced with 600,000 Jews, will be facing about 45 million Arabs in various states. Of course, it's not 45 million Arab soldiers, but large Arab forces invading from all sides. Remember, Israel in the 1948 war had no air force, no armor corps, no navy, no heavy machine guns, no artillery. It was an amazing story. We could do a massive class on the miracle of what is that war, which will last for 9 months. It will be Israel's longest war. Jerusalem almost falls. The road is cut off. It's a very difficult conflict. During that fighting, during the course of that 9 months of fighting, more than 6,000 Israelis will be killed. 1% of the population will die in the War of Independence, which is the equivalent of 3.3 million Americans dying in a war. But we know, as a consequence of the War of Independence, Israel, we not only survive as a country, but Israel actually ends up with more territory than it would have been granted had the Arabs not declared war and invaded, and had there been the division of the territory a la the plan originally laid out by the United Nations in the partition vote in November of 29th, 1947, when the UN voted 33-13 with 10 abstentions to partition what was then called Palestine into separate Arab and separate Jewish states, with Jerusalem being an international city. Now we know, as the one negative consequence of that war, besides the very bloody cost of how and what a difficult struggle it was, with Israel again being really outgunned, especially in terms of equipment, it ended the war with a lot more equipment. I highly recommend everyone read the book by Leonard Slater called The Pledge. Amazing book about how all the Jews in the world put their differences aside, whether it was even Jews involved in organized crime, to work to smuggle weapons in using their Italian friends in organized crime, with the longshoremen in New York to load ships with weapons and smuggle it to Israel. Amazing story. So Israel ended up at the end of the war with more territory than it had started out with, winning a battle against all odds, but suffering very significant casualties. The country was under a state of basically rationing and very difficult economic situation post-War of Independence. The one big casualty of the war, besides the 6,000 Israelis, of 4,000 of whom were soldiers and the remainder were civilians who died in the war, was that Jerusalem was occupied as much as the area north and south, which everyone likes to call the West Bank, was occupied by the Jordanian Legion illegally for 19 years, and Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. Fast forward to 1956, when Nasser comes to power in Egypt and he nationalizes the Suez Canal, and Israel, together with England and France, will do the Suez Campaign, which was, again, a short war that took place in October 1956, where Israel conquers the Sinai and gets all the way to the Suez, and then under basically a huge amount of pressure from the Soviet Union and from America, they're forced to withdraw. But 172 Israeli soldiers will be killed in that conflict. Again, multiply by 50 and you get the number. Fast forward to 1967, and that is really an incredibly significant event in Israel's history, when the Arab world had failed to destroy Israel in 1948 in the War of Independence. Again in 1967. This time it's fewer Arab countries. This time, with the first time around, it was 5 Arab armies with auxiliaries coming from places as far away as Yemen. Now it was basically the armies of Egypt, Syria in the north, in the Golan Heights. Lebanon stays out of it, and young King Hussein of Jordan joins in what's called the Six-Day War in 1967. And the Straits of Tiran are blockaded. The Arab forces are building up to destroy the Jewish state. They were digging mass graves in Jerusalem, preparing for the huge number of casualties. Israel preempts with a brilliant Air Force strike, taking out the air forces of all 3 of these Arab states within the first few hours of the 67 war, starting in June 5th, 1967. And in modern warfare, if your air force is neutralized and the enemy has what's called air supremacy, the battle's basically over. And within 6 days, June 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. Within 6 days, Israel will trounce 3 major Arab armies. First the Egyptian army, then the Jordanian army, and finally, on the last couple days of the war, taking the Golan Heights from the Syrian army. An incredible military victory. And by day 3, June 7th of the 67 war, we know, as they say, this famous sentence, Harabait Biyadenu, for the first time in 2,000 years. Not only is the Jordanian army pushed out of north and south, but Jerusalem, the old city, the Western Wall, is back under the sovereignty of Israel and Jewish control for the first time in 2,000 years. An incredible victory, but at a cost of about the lives of 800 Israeli soldiers. And again, multiply by 50, and that's the equivalent of 125,000 Americans dying in a war. So relatively small number of soldiers killed for an incredible amount of territory gained compared to how many casualties the Arab armies lost. But nonetheless, very intense. And this was a war that took place in a divided city where the front line was people's parents' homes, some of the soldiers, because Jerusalem was a divided city, with Jordanians sitting on the other side of what is today Road Number 1 that runs in between the old city and the Notre Dame Hospice. So in 1973, in Yom Kippur, Israel fights what's called the Yom Kippur War, which was a very, very difficult conflict, October 1973. Israel unfortunately got a little bit cocky and arrogant and suffered massive casualties. Initially, the Arabs had really learned their lessons from 67, rearmed with the help of the Soviet Union with a lot of the best equipment, shoulder-fired, wire-guided missiles, very sophisticated anti-aircraft batteries to neutralize Israel's air force superiority. The Egyptian army will breach the Bar-Lev line, which was on the Suez Canal, because Israel had controlled the Sinai from 1967. And to one side of the Suez Canal, the eastern side, the Syrian army will launch a massive artillery bombardment and a armor invasion of the Golan Heights. Jordan stayed out of this conflict. Initially, the casualties are huge. Israel loses a tremendous number of planes and armor. It was done on Yom Kippur, precisely in an attempt to catch Israel with its guard down. The advantage was back then, BC, before cell phones. Yom Kippur, the whole country shuts down. The vast majority of Israelis, including many soldiers. And Israel's army, you have to appreciate, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but Israel's army is primarily, it has a very large standing army, by the way, but most of Israel's military might are reservists. I mentioned that I did reserve duty. Combat soldiers in the IDF will do reserve duty for decades, into their mid-40s. So Israel relies on its frontline soldiers to stop the initial thrust or attack, but then it will mobilize reservists, which will be the bulk of the army. When Israel's army mobilizes, it's a massive army. And this is before cell phones and all that, but Israel was able to, because the vast majority of people are civilians and were in synagogues. Even the vast majority of secular Israelis were home. It was easy to mobilize the soldiers, and the roads were empty and clear to get them to the front lines. So after an initial thrust through, and with a lot of casualties, and both Egypt and Syria gaining a lot of territory, the invading armies were held off, and Israel counterattacked and was able to win massive victories on both fronts, crossing the Suez Canal, surrounding the Egyptian Third Army, making it to within a few miles of Damascus before they decided, but that came at a terrible price of 2,500 Israelis killed in the Yom Kippur War. 1982, and that was a very big sobering experience for Israel. 1982, when I first came to Israel, I actually was in Paris. I went with my brother who graduated from medical school. We landed in Paris the day the war in Lebanon started. The Palestine Liberation Organization had been thrown out of Jordan in 1975 by King Hussein, had moved into Lebanon, destabilized that country, causing a civil war, launching missiles into Israel. Israel invades in 1982, in June 1982, to get the Palestine Liberation Organization out. They get all the way to Beirut. They get stuck there. I mean, eventually most of the army will pull out, setting up a buffer zone. But even in that war, 652 Israelis will be killed in action in that war. Israel will set up a buffer zone in South Lebanon that will go until the year 2000, when Ehud Barak will finally pull the Israeli army out of South Lebanon, and the South Lebanese army will collapse, and then Unfortunately, Hezbollah will move in and take over, make it even a worse enemy than the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In 2006, they will launch an unprovoked attack on Israelis patrolling the border and an unpatrolled artillery barrage of northern Israel, leading to the First Lebanon War. Again, another war which will last for many weeks, in which 120 Israelis will be killed in action. You have in 2008, 2009, you can have the first Gaza War. In 2005, Israel pulled out of Gaza during Ariel Sharon, and Hamas took over and threw the Palestine Liberation Organization out of, or the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza, and turns it into a launching pad for missile attacks on Israel. So 2008, 2009, my son at the time was serving in his regular military service. He was a medic and a sniper in that war in 2008, 2009. In 2014, by the way, the first soldier killed in that war, I was living in Givat Ze'ev at the time. The first soldier killed was a boy from our neighborhood. He was a friend of both my sons. His name was Dvir Emanuelov, who was in a reconnaissance unit of the Golani Brigade. Incredible story. And Dvir not only lost her son, but her husband died of cancer more or less around the same time. Very tragic story for an amazing young man. I used to pray on Friday night in the Bnei Akiva Minyan in Givat Ze'ev, and the mechitza separating the screen that separates the men's and women's sections was decorated with the names of the 6 boys who had died fighting in various wars and conflicts and counter-terrorist operations. These were kids from our neighborhood that I knew. I know their parents. Very different experience. In 2014, Israel had second Gaza War, again caused by the Hamas firing hundreds of missiles and mortars into civilian areas. This is what Israel has to deal with. It's always on the front line. My second oldest son, who was already out of Golani, went in as a reservist. He was 38 days before, during, and after that war. He was in Gaza, going in with an Armor Corps unit as a medic, and I have to say that was the scariest time for myself and for my wife, just living, because you didn't hear. They took their phones away, and once a week when he came out, they give him his phone for a couple of minutes. He'd call us, "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." I said, "Hey, Daniel, how you doing?" He says, "I'm okay. I'm not hurt." "Where are you?" I can't say anything. "What's going on?" "I can't tell you anything. I'm going to go back in again soon. I love you. Bye." And that was it. And then we wouldn't hear from him for another 7 days. So that was the reality of that war, and we see that this is constant. Sadly, the Jewish people, who we are so obsessed with peace, the word shalom appears 240 times in the Hebrew Bible, yet we have been plagued with constant warfare. No people has desired peace more and had so little peace. And there's so much more to say about this, but just to appreciate when we get to Memorial Day, it is such a central part of our existence. And it's so interwoven with the identity of the modern state of Israel. I highly recommend, better than me telling you, and I have some amazing stories that I could tell you, but we're pretty much out of time. Please go to YouTube and watch Miriam Peretz, Peretz or Z if you're British or South African, speaking. It's 2011, speaking at the FIDF dinner. It's a YouTube video you can watch. She was a neighbor of mine in Givat Ze'ev. Her third oldest son and my oldest son went to school together. She has 6 children. She was born in Morocco. All 4 of her sons, I'm not going to do a spoiler for you on this, but all 4 of her sons fought in Golani, were like commanders in Golani, elite Golani units, and her 2 daughters married, I think, officers in the Golani Brigade. It is an incredible story. Either during or before Memorial Day, you have to watch that. But I'd just like to close with an understanding. I, as a historian, appreciate that anti-Semitism and hatred of us has plagued the Jewish people throughout history. It is as old as we are. It goes back to the book of Genesis. We have to also appreciate that for 2,000 years, from the destruction of the Second Temple until the middle of the 20th century, we Jews lived exiled in other people's lands as minorities, with no passport, no flag, no country, no army, no one to defend us, at the mercy of others. Since the birth of the state of Israel, the miraculous rebirth of Israel that we'll talk about in the next class, we have to appreciate that we now have an army to defend us. And now that almost half the Jews in the world are living in Israel, and the rebirth of Israel is supernatural, and the fact that for the first time we have an IDF, an Israeli Defense Force, we have a refuge for the Jewish people, we have our own country, we have our own passport, our flag, our embassy, and our own army to defend us, is something that we have to appreciate and be thankful for, and we should pray every day for the safety and well-being of not just the Jewish state, but for those brave people who have continued to fight for the Jewish state, and for all those who died, Al Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name, so that we Jewish people can survive and live freely in this little miracle of a modern democratic free state, which is located in the worst neighborhood in the world, surrounded by so much violence and terrorism and threats. Yet we live in this little miracle in the Mediterranean, thanks to a lot of help from the big guy upstairs and a lot of sacrifice from people who have fought and died to create and maintain the Jewish state in the Israeli Defense Forces. We should have peace in the land of Israel and no more war. I want to thank you for watching Aish Live, and you can follow us on Facebook to stay up to date on all the latest content that we will be offering you.